welcome everybody to the esports panel. I'm looking ahead what's next for esports, and I'm Pieter. We've got a pretty sort of like big panel today, not just sort of like the number of people, but also not again. But also sort of like the caliber of the companies that they represent, and sort of like what they've already sort of like achieved in esports. So I'll provide a short introduction in a minute, but I mean, this panel is really about like looking ahead what is next for esports. And I mean, we're only in January, so I think what we'll probably do first is ask the panel a little bit about what have been the most significant developments last year, and then sort of like ask them on their views of what do they think the rest of 2019 and beyond will bring for esports, and especially what that will mean for game developers more generally. So I think this is a very good opportunity to get some insights from people who have like different roles and different perspectives in esports, and that can be very, very valuable. It's a panel. We'll probably get some views and some discussions, but most of all, it's an opportunity for you guys to ask questions. You've got 6 people here, very, very knowledgeable in esports, and use that opportunity to ask them whatever you'd like to ask them if it's about esports, I would say. So, on the panel today, let me start. I provided a little bit of an introduction, but first of all, and I'll start with Nikita, and the reason why I should start with Nikita is if you are representing a company that's made a game that's not just doing terribly well, but also manages to get you a huge cardboard cow in the room. I mean,
it delivers the internet.
Yes, it does. I mean, that's when you have arrived when you're sort of like into esports. So Nikita, he's with Game Insights, the company behind Guns of Boom, who've been doing very, very well in the mobile space. And you probably have seen Nikita at previous Pocket Connects or been to his earlier talk. Then we have Malte, Barth from BITKRAFT, who are pretty big in esports, but it's a company that maybe not everyone knows because they're investors and sort of like very, very sort of like skilled investors, I would say, in the esports space with various different fingers in lots of esport pies. And before that, Malte was with MTG, the company that owns, well, amongst others, ESL and DreamHack. So a very sort of like well-established background in the esports space. Then David Yarnton, who's started sort of like in the Stone Ages, which in game years is about 30 years ago, with things like Nintendos and 8-bit computers. And he moved on from Nintendo to a company called Gfinity, which has been pretty active in organizing tournaments. But as in every sort of like fast-moving business, between the time I ask someone to join a panel and they actually show up, they all of a sudden work for a different company, in this case Edge Esports, and David will tell you a bit more about that in a few minutes. Then next person I'd like to introduce is Sergi Burgos. He is with LVP, which I guess might be a company that not everyone here knows. LVP is Spanish for like the League of Video Game Professionals, so professional video game esports players. He's a co-founder of that company, and they managed to sort of like get acquired by MediaPro, which is a very large Spanish media conglomerate, who are very good at sports rights management. So their take and their view on esports is also coming from that angle, and I think that can provide some very good insights from the sports rights management point of view. Then Sam Chandola, you probably know him as a founder and sort of like previous attendee of Pocket Gamers and other games conferences of V2 games. He's now involved with Audacia, if I pronounce that correctly, and one of the portfolio companies or esports arms is Pepper.gg, online free-to-enter, not free-to-play, cash tournament organizer or platform. And then we have James Dean from ESL. Well, if you don't know ESL and you're here to ask about esports, I'm not entirely sure whether this is the correct venue. I mean, that's the company that sort of put esports on the map, and I don't think it needs sort of much more introduction. So what I would like to do is ask ask a number of the panelists for like what did they consider to be sort of one of the main sort of like determining events in esports in 2018, and after that I think it's time to sort of like get the crystal ball out and look what's ahead for the rest of the year. So Malte, if you want to sort of like start off, if you would have to describe what for you was sort of like the main thing in esports in 2018, what would that be?
Yeah. Hey everyone, thanks for having me. Great being on the panel with you guys. I think there's esports is so much happening in a year. It's almost like in a generation in other sports. So it's always hard to pick kind of this single one most important thing. What struck me the most is really that 18 was kind of the pivotal year where esports got pushed into mainstream. And I kind of had this little test. So if I would have run kind of any high street almost globally and talked to a mom, like an ordinary mom on the street, and say, hey, what do you think esports is? 1.5 years ago, she would have looked at me very strangely. It's like, okay, I don't know what he's talking about. If I did this in mid of 2018, almost any man globally is like, oh, this is Fortnite, and my entire home is totally poisoned by this thing. And so that is a big, massive change to me. And almost with that in numbers, I think there's more like 100 million kind of new players joined esports, at least on that type of game, which I think pushed it to an entire new level.
Sorry? Yeah. Okay. I mean, you have to train that internet cow a little bit better, Nikita. But Nikita, while we're at it then, what do you think, other than these kind of things, what was for you sort of like the key thing?
So for us as a mobile game developer, of course, the most important thing was that from our point of view, last year mobile esports become a part of this mainstream and kind of proved that it deserves this place. And as we look at esports as a funnel, we could see that mobile audience is at the very beginning of this funnel. So, and without that bunch of people, I would say that in the future esports would not be so massive, would not be so popular at all. I mean, we need these super accessible games, super easy to play, and games that don't require any special equipment, any super expensive stuff. Just App Store, mobile, play, win, and go further. So the next step is probably CSGO or something else. But I mean, to begin with, everybody will start to play with mobile. Mm-hmm. That's the most important impact from the past year, I would say. Okay,
and maybe for Sergio, I mean, from your perspective, like, which is probably also a little bit more from like the tournament and media angle, what was for you sort of like the key thing that you saw in the market in 2018?
I think that there's been a couple of things. I think that the most visible thing has been like the pouring of a lot of money into the ecosystem, mostly because of the development of the franchise or pseudo-franchise leagues, and that's been like all around all the time. But I would coincide with Nikita. I think that the biggest trend that has gone a bit like ignored is like the real beginning of mobile esports, at least from our point of view as LVP. It definitely was. I mean, it's the first time that we've had games with numbers that would directly compete, that are comparable with the big juggernauts like League of Legends. I'm mentioning mostly Clash Royale, but also other games like Free Fire, for example.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about mobile, is you say sort of you see sort of like games competing with League of Legends, and when you think League of Legends, you think, okay, that can fill stadia with people, and it's got millions of viewers online. I mean, where sort of like in the mobile space do you sort of like, I mean, mobile, if you sort of like paint the spectrum, you'll see sort of like competitive gameplay on mobile, and it starts to transition a little bit more sort of like esporty, but where for a company like MediaPro LVP becomes mobile sort of like esports?
For us, it's a matter of audience. I mean, the most important thing for a content company is how many people will be watching. This is kind of related of how many people is playing, although not completely or necessarily the same people playing are the same people watching. But for us, in order to invest in a new game or in a new competition, it has to be the potential to gather a massive audience. And in this case, with Clash Royale, we were very early adopters, very early, like organizing a regular league 1 year before Supercell actually started. So. But we were very bullish about the game, and it delivered. So, because we knew that that there was a huge potential audience that were eager for more casual, more accessible competitive experience.
Okay, and sort of the more casual experience. I mean, maybe Sam, how do you see that sort of like filter through to sort of like where it becomes sort of like accessible for mobile game developers, because some of these games are really, really huge. There'll be smaller games that will be competitive, have esports elements, but what do you see happening there?
I think so. If you think about the traditional PC esports games, they are not simple games. They're fairly complicated and complex games, but obviously over time people got into it, people adapted them, and it just grew on them to the extent that a lot of bugs in the old esports games were considered features, and they were now exploit strategies. I think with mobile, obviously you're appealing to a fairly different audience set. You're appealing to an audience that is used to a more simpler experience. And talking about Vainglory, which was a complex mobile game that came out a few years ago, tried a lot to get a competitive scene going, had a moderate level of success, but never really the same level of success that Clash Royale did, for example. And it boiled down to Clash's just ease of access and accessibility. And I don't think it's an esports question, but more of a game design and a game development direction on how simple or how complicated you want to make it. I think the more important aspect, especially in mobile free-to-play, is how do you make it even for everybody. Mobile free-to-play, obviously people can pay real money and get an advantage, and that can completely spoil esports from the experience, because if it's not fair, then people won't consider it as traditional sports. So I think more and more we might see special game modes in mobile game experiences where no matter what your individual level is, in the main progression, you're probably going to have like a fixed/finite level in which you're competing with everybody else, either scaled up or scaled down to a certain level, to keep the playing field fair.
Yeah. Okay, and so I think a few things that are sort of like pretty clear, and most of you have sort of like picked up on that. I mean, yes, mainstream. I mean, certainly like PC desktop esports was pretty sort of like getting mainstream already. It's even more so the case, and mobile definitely becoming a much more sort of like important part of it. So if we sort of like start to look ahead, and that's what this panel is about, and then maybe James, if you could sort of like give some insights on this. Where do you sort of like see these developments sort of like going? What direction do you think we're heading, and how does that affect what you guys are doing at ESL?
That's a very long answer. I think if I was to pick one, and certainly if we lead off from what's happened last year, as we all know, esports is an extremely disruptive industry, probably one of the most disruptive industries in the world right now, and we're changing a lot of models in the same way. And I think what we're certainly observing is that the intellectual property that's behind the whole of esports as an industry is really finding its place. And we're talking about the game developers, we're also talking about the tournament operators, and we're talking about the brands behind that, and of course we're talking about the sports IPs who are also looking at this space. So we've seen EPL and with Premier League and FIFA, Olympic Games starting to look at the space, and many motorsports, etc. So I think for me it's how the commercial models start to mature. And we're seeing some very interesting aspects. If we look at a game, it will buy in day one, in theory, right, Nikki? You're making money. But ultimately, esports is going to be an incremental revenue for any potential IP. And that is what really is working itself out. So once that audience and that engaged player base is starting to hit a tipping point, I think the most notable thing is we're seeing the very large non-endemic brands come into the space and really uplift that in many, many respects. It's not just about the money, of course. Obviously, the money is nice, the money is helping support the entire ecosystem, but ultimately what it's doing is driving the entire industry forward, because it allows us to tell more stories, create more content, get more mainstream media. In fact, it's like it's a viral aspect of the industry in that way. And if we look in recent times, it really is the non-endemic brands that are driving forward those big changes that means we can take things to the next level. So it won't be long, I'm sure, that Guns of Boom will be attracting some big brands to get behind the game and the audience that they're delivering. For example, we're certainly seeing it in the PC titles, but I'm sure it will come more so with the mobile titles. And in fact, just last weekend, we were at BT Sports Studios running the EE mobile series with Clash Royale. So seeing that effect, you've got a massive telco in the UK, a huge professional TV broadcasting studios with an esport game inside it and running a tournament, and I think that's really exciting. So we'll see a lot more of that this year.
Okay, and in talking about tournaments and sort of like league and ownership and sort of like business models, maybe David and Sergi can elaborate a little bit on that. Like, are there sort of things that have proven definitely not to work, and I mean examples of things where it didn't go that well and probably will be done differently or tried differently? I would be curious about that. For either one of you.
I wasn't really going to talk about that, but because I was actually thought I'd keep on the track of future as such, and to some extent when you start looking back at what hasn't worked, it's all part of the learning process. Yep. And I thought some of the really good things, and being parochial here in the UK, was when ESL 1 came to the UK in Birmingham. I thought that was a really big major event for that, and then also with Face It, bringing CSGO major to London. Two of those things. I mean, the UK is far behind to some, I say far behind, is got so much opportunity in esports, and that's why I think the future is we're sort of looking at. And I look at the fact there's 2.6, probably by now 2.7 billion people in the world that play games, and you probably think most of them play on mobile. I was a real negative person on mobile as far as opportunity for esports until 12 months ago, and I got introduced to Guns of Boom, and now I am a huge fan. So I was almost like, I felt like I was a kid at a sort of a rock concert, and when Nick was talking earlier, I was all sort of gooey about it. But that to me opens up huge opportunities, because combination is with esports, it's quite parochially male, and so many females play mobile games, etc., that they don't consider themselves gamers, so it gives us opportunity to grow it there. And the other one is, and so I'm sort of a little bit off the track, you asked a question about tournaments, but the one thing that I thought was really good this year, and as a sign, was Mercedes-Benz buying 60-70% of SK Gaming. Now, that is really quite a major, I think, stepstone where, and endemic brand is buying into esports, not just promotion. And I start questioning then, when is an endemic brand, or non-endemic brand become endemic? And it's starting to merge, and that, I think, is such an exciting thing, is that esports is starting to become ubiquitous. And as you were saying earlier, walking down the street, talking to parents, they know about it now. And this is why it's so exciting with esports. And we always talk about in esports that an esports year is like 7 dog years, just moving so quickly, and there's just so many opportunity. When you start talking about tournaments, I mean, there are so many people getting into it. That's the issue, though. There's so many people see the money and are getting into esports and wanting to run tournaments, and they're not all successful, and it then sometimes leaves a bad taste in sponsors' mouths, players' mouths, teams' mouths. I won't say mouths because they don't get paid and someone runs off with the money, because there's people coming who don't understand the culture, don't understand the systems and the way things work, and understand that there's a community that drives it, not just the big money. So I got off the track a bit.
That's all right. That's all right. I mean, it's a panel. We'd like to get your insights. And
that's what happens when you got a fossil on here.
Yeah.
You want to swap seats?
Sergio, anything you'd like to add to that?
I'll do everything differently. But talking about esports, about tournaments in particular, and kind of related to mobile esports, but I would never, put a lot of effort in a title if the publisher does not have a very clear strategy. Because the worst that can happen to you is that they don't have a strategy, and then suddenly they have one, or they change from one to the other constantly, and this keeps, basically making your life very miserable. So I wouldn't invest for a title as a tournament unless the publisher has things very clear.
I have a question about that, if that's all right. How then, because from my experience, and probably Nikita can correct us both, but what fascinates me about that comment is the fact that games by their own right, and I'm not a game developer, but from what I understand, they very much depend on the data of the playing habits of their game. So if esports is endemically part of the game from the start, because it's been designed with creating esports content in mind, and tournaments, if there's a particular success or non-success around a particular way an esport strategy is being run, then how do they adapt to a new strategy if it's not working? Or do they just have to include the tournament operator as part of that?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't think that it's necessary that they include tournament operators, although I think it would be for some of them a very good idea, because what happens is that publishers actually entered the esports scene relatively recently. I mean, it's not like esports is gone like for 20 years, okay, like ESL. But the publishers really entered the market like about, some of them 2-3 years ago. Riot Games maybe earlier than that, and most of them are playing the game by ear, so they don't really. They have most of the time the same misconceptions that the general audience, that the general media, and this makes them like trying to copy previous success stories, and sometimes they don't work for their game. So I do think that even they, not necessarily include tournament organizers, but they should be very open to have discussions with different stakeholders, including tournament organizers, and to try to get to know the ecosystem much better than they do. Have I answered the question?
No. It wasn't a test.
No, but sometimes I don't get all the.
Yeah. I mean, just you mentioned ecosystem, and I'd like to ask Malte a little bit about that, because I mean, you are investing in esports, but I think what maybe not everyone here knows that is actually sort of like pretty wide, and it's touching things that are not sort of like directly game or sort of like tournament related, and how do you see that sort of like trend going, and what are you doing with that with BITKRAFT to the extent you can share?
Sure. I mean, like we've been over the years been very active in trying to build the ecosystem and kind of help to flourish it in a certain way. And obviously we talk a lot about the underlying content, and I think that game is obviously the key asset there in esports. But for us, it's way bigger because there's a big technology opportunity around esports. Everything, if you think of how you build an esports game, how you run it, how you distribute, how you watch it, how you spectate it, and that kind of stuff, is this big tech stack from infrastructure, the deepest level, up to kind of peripheral technology, hardware technology even, that needs to be in place and very nicely aligned to enable esports seamlessly. And I think the seamlessly is a big one. I mean, having like thinking the consumer in mind, and like I like to take a deeper look and say, okay, if you take a consumer, what is the cycle? The cycle is really, playing, watching, spectating, and really engaging, and then going in cycles around that, and making it super easy for him to do so is almost impossible right now, which I think is a big barrier in esports, and technology can big time help to solve for that, and this is why we look a lot into technologies that enable that kind of stuff. And then thirdly, with esports now being mainstream and becoming, and this is the point for me, really is becoming cultural forming, mainstream culture, pop culture, which all other sports we've seen growing over the last hundreds of years, they kind of define their little set of cultural products around tribal brands in sports, and that is touches so many points outside of the actual game and outside of the technology, which is a big direct to consumer opportunity. May it be fashion, may it be nutrition, may it be travel, may it be hospitality, may it be insurance, and there's a whole lot of things which really is being tailored to esports fans and esports players, and we have a very wide peripheral view on that, because that raises the tides on many level and enables great new propositions to come into and serve kind of the next generation consumers in a very different way, with essentially traditional needs in a certain way. Okay, so let's also sort of like take some time to get questions from the room, because the guys are here. This is your chance to sort of like ask questions. But what I'm hearing is, yes, there's going to be more growth. It's going to grow wider beyond just purely game and watching, playing. It's culture defining, if I get the, sort of like the term correctly from Malte.
I think the way we call it over at Pepper is we just call it the inclusion of non-gamers into the world of esports. And I think that's what we're seeing now, as opposed to, when ESL started organizing tournaments, when it was just, hardcore gamers getting into tournaments.
Yeah. So that's, I think, safe to say something that's sort of like looking ahead for esports. That's definitely sounds like that's what's next. But questions about what is next, or what does it mean for you as game developers or as publishers or related sort of like in the game space? Raise your hands, we'll get you a mic, and hopefully we'll get you a sensible answer.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Haney, and I used to work at Super Evil, so built Vainglory Esports, so thanks for the call out. Actually, my question is, I think a big learning for us building a mobile esport was the format of it, the 8-hour live broadcast on Twitch. It's very not viewer-friendly. So the future of the format, where do you think it's going? Will we have a Netflix of esports, or, I don't know, YouTube esports specifically? Like, where is that all going? Because personally, I don't think the 12-hour broadcasts make a lot of sense.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the question. It's really nice. Actually, what I was about to say regarding the future of the esports is that esports, as well as any sport, traditional sport, is a show at the first place. And the main goal of any developer, of any platform, of any participant of the ecosystem is to make this show more spectacular than it is today. For example, I'm a big fan of Formula 1, for example, but my kids, they cannot understand the thing. They ask me consistently, like, how you can, been sitting for 2 hours looking at this television and, nothing happening there. I mean, they are just, driving and driving around. And esports, what makes it special, for now at least, is something completely new, something much more dynamic, something which is more, I would say, fits the current generation. They understand it better because they play these games. They watch it, they play it, and it's something, it's a part of their lives. Okay, so, and of course, our, again, main goal is to make it as watchable as it possible, and to push it in the right direction. And of course, with all these, shortened formats which become more and more popular among the youngsters, of course, we cannot afford to make these, hours and hours of online shows. Nobody watches these, 8 hours broadcasts or 5 hours broadcasts. The most popular YouTube videos are like less than minutes long, right? Yep. So that's something we should, deal with.
Yeah, I think there's some work to be done in that space, but I'm sure people are working on that as we speak.
I was going to use a cricket analogy, which might work in this country for a change, because we started with test formats, and 5 days long, right? And 5 days people used to sit and watch, and then that started going out of fashion. We moved to the 1 day format, 8 hours, and that's going out of fashion. And now we have the T20, which is a 3-hour format. And so I think the same is applying just to esports. Esports is nothing but traditional sports in a new format. And I think totally fair with going shorter and shorter. I'm going to predict 15 minutes is an average sweet spot for a match where you can get in, get the action, move on if you want to.
Yeah, that's why, for example, mobile esports here again is in a better position than any other esports, because, for example, in Gansu we have fixed 5-minute sessions. It doesn't take much time to play it. You don't have to invest time, you don't have to invest money, you don't have to invest, it doesn't cost you arguing with your mother or whether you have to play or not. Yep. So,
okay.
There's one observation, one perspective I'd like to offer. When I look at what's happening right now with all the content being produced, and there's a lot of money going into content, I guess the overall ecosystem has a little bit of a challenge right now, because there's not a lot of money flowing against that. I think this is a big problem for the industry, because we kind of set out in this free-to-use content is for free internet world, where everything is consumed and this is all great, and the model is really, I show you the stuff on my platform and I take your data, and that's kind of the deal. That deal doesn't work, I think. And then for us as an industry, we got to really get our heads together and finding some sort of a premium model around it. That, I don't want to think like paywalls and excluding people, but giving them some more value in the broadcast to actually pay for, to make this a viable model. Like when thinking of music back in the days when it was dying, it's really bad if you see creators not being paid, they can't make a living. It's so important of a cultural thing that was actually dying, and then Apple taking a step to making a premium again and giving it back to life. I think this is kind of, I'm not painting the same picture for esports here, but as a tendency, I'd like to make that point, that we need to find some sort of a nice business model and align interest in the interest of being able to produce more content in great storyline. And that's the other thing, is like, I think it's all tribal and storyline. The storyline kind of defines essentially really what's a broadcast about, because the story, I mean, the way we are wired in our brain is we're wired by stories, so we're not wired by 8-hour broadcasts. That's not how we work, and this is not how consumers work. They work around storylines, and like thinking storylines first, and you see like small little memes, like they make it to the millions and millions of views, and the 8-hour of broadcast nobody fucking watches, and you go like, how can it be that this 2-second thing makes it to millions, whereas this great 8-hour production nobody's actually watching? It's cats or ninja or something else. No, but I'm saying no. This is really because and then that's a connection between kind of the viewer and his personality and his tribal type of nature to the story, and that's kind of how it's wired in our brain. Much more thinking storyline. I think we as an industry, we're more like games people. It's not necessarily storyline people. And I think adding a little bit more storyline can help a lot.
Okay.
Can I just shamelessly plug that's
sure.
what the government has given us $4 million to do this year?
Yeah,
to figure that out.
I think definitely for the UK, major coup, sort of like get that recognition of sort of like bureaucrats parting with hard cash to sort of like support esports. That's
John Simpson will become UK Minister of Esports anyway.
Yeah.
Vote for him.
Hi, my name is Justin. So I've been I was started in esports as a player in 2005, so I've seen a lot of the booms and busts that you guys have talked about. Question for you guys. From the esports player side that I noticed when I played, so I used to be top 50 for like WoW and Call of Duty and stuff, and got into Dota 2 and the whole digital gambling side. What I noticed is it's very much kind of flavor of the week a lot of the times before developers actually push a lot of money into esports and actually developing these communities and reaching out to like franchises like Cloud9 and Echo Fox and a lot of others. My question is for you guys, because the cost of game engines is coming down, more developers are thinking about this multi-platform strategy now, which they've never had the ability or access to. So you don't have these siloed ecosystems of mobile, PC, or console anymore. What does that mean for you guys, essentially, on the esports side? Because games can be pushed out much more quickly, you can have the multi-platform, and it's really more kind of like what you guys talked about. It's the social, it's the story side. That's why you have games like Fortnite and Rocket League that are huge, because it's not about the game anymore. It's about the accessibility, the on-demand access to the Gen Zers and millennials, and to be able to have that experience with people.
I think from a tournament side of things, the operator side, it would be really nice, because there's countless times we've had to actually run 3 versions of the same tournament because of each platform. But of course, I suppose really Nikita could probably answer this a lot better in terms of the gameplay, but obviously there's challenges to make sure that it is fair across all the platforms, and you don't have an unfair advantage with that human-computer interaction, the touchscreen versus a keyboard and mouse. I mean, I remember a friend of mine had one of those little dongles that allowed you to play on console with a keyboard and mouse, and funnily enough, he was always top of the leaderboard.
I'll tell you a little story about that after.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
So PUBG Mobile is extremely popular in India, where a lot of my friends play it back home. And so I found out they were competing in tournaments for PUBG Mobile, playing the game on an Android emulator on PC, using a keyboard and mouse. And that's the level of passion and intensity, I guess, that people are willing to go to just win. Yeah. Right? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've got 2 different points. I mean, this is the same kind of sense, but 2 different points of view as a developer and as a kind of a gamer. So as a developer, I can say that it's completely impossible to let people play the same game from different devices, different kind of platforms, because it of course provides some of them with advantages to play the game. As a user, as a gamer, one of the biggest disappointments of the last year, for example, for me, was one of the PlayStation titles, a shooter, which I bought and tried to play, and I found out that I can do 0 kills because I just got killed immediately. I got into battle because the guys put me into the same servers where the guys with PC plays. So it just doesn't make any sense. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, right. Let's do one.
But
yeah.
I think one thing we noticed though was with Rainbow Six specifically, and we launched the UK National League Rainbow Six on Xbox on the console, and by the end of the tournament, 80% of the players asked if we could then transition to PC. So in effect, they identified the PC as the master race of that particular game. So I think that the device will prevail according to what game it is, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, thanks. I think we are running out of time. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their views and sharing that. And particularly like to thank Game Insight for that wonderful cardboard thing that provides the internet, I've heard, and I'm very curious what it will bring next year. Right, thanks, guys.
No, before you guys go, don't move. Don't move. Before you guys go, first thank again for thinking Game Insight. We call the cow Gertrude. That's our new best friend. It's a name. Her name is Gertrude. Gertrude? Yeah, Gertrude. We would like to show a video before we can start with the influencers track with my colleague Danielle presenting. So,
okay, thanks.